Welcome everyone. Glad to see you on my channel. Today I will tell you about an unusual story, an amazing story about companionship and love. I wish you a pleasant audience.
Their family seemed a bit odd to those around them, but upon closer acquaintance it was enviable. Tony was over 40, more like 50, and he ran a successful business, selling antique furniture. This was the meaning of his life. He had started once with the fact that he was the owner of a small store of antiques. Now he was approached by the most famous people who wanted to have in their home something unique. Tony himself also had a beautiful house in the suburbs, where he lived with a wife half his age. In the city, this couple was known to almost everyone. The businessman did a lot of charity work. His photos were often printed in the local newspaper. So Walker was so used to being recognized on the streets that he automatically nodded to people who greeted him. He couldn't remember who they were or when they'd met. But when he and Natalie traveled abroad, they were often mistaken for father and daughter. Tony was boiling inwardly. Nothing irritated him more than the suggestion that he was Natalie's father. The young woman herself, naive and direct, simply let such remarks pass her ears. Although at one time she had been married solely on the basis of calculation. And this calculation was made not only on the wealth of the future spouse, but also on his age. Natalie was the only late child and the apple of her parents' eye. The family was also very wealthy. For a long time, it had everything one could wish for except a child. Husband and wife went to bat to solve the problem. And serious pathologies did not seem to have serious pathologies. Doctors could not confidently name the reason why the pregnancy did not come. And then suddenly everything worked out. But the girl was born weak, which sometimes happens in the not young spouses. And again, they made every possible effort to Natalie's strength, and sometimes that the baby with her mother for 6 months lived in resorts. By adolescence, Natalie had outgrown endless illnesses, but remained as thin, fragile, and tender. She was often tormented by migraines, and her father and mother anxiously discussed her fate. Both of them realized that they could not be a lone support to their daughter as the years passed. On the other hand, the girl would have to get married sooner or later. They used the word have to, believing that physiology would inevitably demand its own. And the divorce statistics were not encouraging. There would be some young man who would think of himself first and foremost, and in a few years he would get bored with Natalie, become infatuated with a new skirt, and demand a divorce. How will weak Natalie take it? A marriage like that would break her heart. She and Tony met at a social event. The couple was interested in this middle-aged businessman, so charming and erudite. They invited him to their place, and there he saw Natalie for the first time. He courted her by today's standards very long 2 years, and only then decided to make an offer. At first, the parents of the girl only seemed that their daughter kind of liked the businessman, but they then did not seriously consider this union, too big a difference in age. But Tony behaved very discreetly, courted beautifully, and gradually their opinion began to change. He would be happy to take care of Natalie all his life, to blow dust off her, exclaimed her mother. Yes, he would be able to give Natalie a quiet life, a good home and wealth. She would not have to think about earning money, and he would hardly run around, agreed her father thoughtfully. The girl herself did not aspire to an early marriage, so her mother had to push her a little. You are beautiful. Many times in life you will notice that someone likes you, she persuaded her daughter, but experience does not come immediately and, as a rule, associated with bitter mistakes. Look at Tony. I'm sure that they will never leave you, and if you get sick, he will do his best to put you back on your feet. You know how nice it is to have a man who will protect you from all the troubles of life, will not only love, but also spoil. In between, the family went to visit Tony. All three of them were impressed by the large, well-finished house, but Natalie was delighted by the garden, a real work of landscape art. They sat in the gazebo until late in the evening. The artificial light was on. It seemed that hundreds of colorful moths were hovering over the garden. The fountain was beautifully lit and the roses were fragrant. Natalie felt as if she were in a fairy tale. Little by little, she got used to Tony and eventually said she would marry him. She had nothing to compare her feelings to. She had never loved anyone before. The wedding was played. As Walker later said, chamber. There were few guests, but all people famous. No bride price, no contest of course, was not. Sat at the wedding table, danced a waltz, and the evening ended with the fact that the young went on a wedding trip first to the station, from there by train to New York, and then they were waiting for a cruise to Scandinavia. 7 years had passed since then. Although Natalie's parents had said from the beginning that they were not old and that their retirement was not far off, they were still a bit deceitful and hoped to be happy for their daughter and, of course, to see their grandchildren for a long time to come. And if they were lucky, to raise them. But none of that happened. Natalie never had children, and her parents died in an accident. They lived in a remote area of the city where the only road through the forest led. It was beautiful, but not quite safe, because it was a serpentine road. Every year, this road claimed several lives. After that, Natalie was practically an orphan. She had relatives somewhere else in the southern city, and that was all. Now the young woman was completely dependent on her husband. Not materially by the will, she was the only heiress of her parents, but she felt infinitely lonely, and Tony, as predicted, became for her both husband and father at the same time. Since Natalie had married him when she was barely out of high school, Tony asked her if she wanted to study further, and if so, for whom. The young woman was a little confused. Her schooling was very average and she had no pronounced aptitudes. Books she liked to read, yes. What else? I really like our garden. Maybe I'll design it. In the first year of marriage, she had invariably spoken to her husband in a shy tone. Tony was very pleased. His wife's hobby suited him just fine. He paid for Natalie's very expensive courses, and now she took great pleasure in helping the elderly gardener, suggesting that he change one thing or another. The garden had become her personal pride, and from every trip, the couple brought back some rare and beautiful plants, which found a place in their corner of paradise. Natalie experienced the death of her parents very hard. Tony realized for the first time what was meant by Natalie's fragile health. From the shock, she lay for days with a high fever that could not be brought down. When she finally got up, she was very weak and apathetic. It was down to the psychiatrist and antidepressants. Tony, for the 100th time, forbade himself to even dream of having children. A child would be born, thank God, and if not, they would get over it. Fear for his wife came first. Tony didn't think he could love so deeply and it would cause heartache. That's why he had complicated feelings when a distant relative of Natalie's, a 7th cousin, a 4th cousin, came to town. His name was John. He had long ago gone into science, had lived in England for several years where he was doing some research. He'd gotten his doctorate, and now, back in the US, he was going to teach at the university. With Natalie, they saw only in distant childhood, when the girl was brought to vacation to the sea in the same city where John's parents lived. But now, returning to the United States, John was going to settle here in the regional center. And Natalie was so genuinely happy to have a new relative that she asked her husband to put her brother in their house. "We have so much space," she said. "You only come home in the evening and I'm alone all day. I could work somewhere, but you don't want to hear about it. And John's lectures will be over by lunchtime. I'll have more fun. And him? These men of science are so unsuitable. If you put him alone, he'll sit on stale bread and instant noodles. Here he'll feel at home." Tony hesitated. He hid from his young wife how jealous he was. Hence his reluctance to let Natalie go to work and his infrequent receptions. He hated to refuse Natalie, but everything in him rebelled against agreeing. "Let her stay with us," he said uncertainly, "and then we'll see." John was very grateful for the invitation. He could only work in a big city where there were universities, so the option of returning to his hometown was out of the question. And he really wanted to feel at least a little warmth from people close to him. So far, he had never married because he remained unsuitable according to Natalie and a weirdo according to Tony. And the more Walker took a closer look at Natalie's relative, the calmer he became. If John was home, he spent most of his time reading books or on the computer. He stayed up well past midnight on the internet, his correspondence in English. Tony looked over his shoulder and couldn't understand anything. Their family seemed a bit odd to those around them, but upon closer acquaintance, it was enviable. Tony was over 40, more like 50, and he ran a successful business, selling antique furniture. This was the meaning of his life. He had started once with the fact that he was the owner of a small store of antiques. Now he was approached by the most famous people who wanted to have in their home something unique. Tony himself also had a beautiful house in the suburbs, where he lived with a wife half his age. In the city, this couple was known to almost everyone. The businessman did a lot of charity work. His photos were often printed in the local newspaper. So Walker was so used to being recognized on the streets that he automatically nodded to people who greeted him. He couldn't remember who they were or when they'd met. But when he and Natalie traveled abroad, they were often mistaken for father and daughter. Tony was boiling inwardly. Nothing irritated him more than the suggestion that he was Natalie's father. The young woman herself, naive and direct, simply let such remarks pass her ears. Although at one time she had been married solely on the basis of calculation. And this calculation was made not only on the wealth of the future spouse, but also on his age. Natalie was the only late child and the apple of her parents' eye. The family was also very wealthy. For a long time, it had everything one could wish for except a child. Husband and wife went to bat to solve the problem. And serious pathologists did not seem to have serious pathologies. Doctors could not confidently name the reason why the pregnancy did not come. And then suddenly everything worked out. But the girl was born weak, which sometimes happens in the not young spouses. And again, they made every possible effort to Natalie's strength, and sometimes that the baby with her mother for 6 months lived in resorts. By adolescence, Natalie had outgrown endless illnesses, but remained as thin, fragile, and tender. She was often tormented by migraines, and her father and mother anxiously discussed her fate. Both of them realized that they could not be a lone support to their daughter as the years passed. On the other hand, the girl would have to get married sooner or later. They used the word have to, believing that physiology would inevitably demand its own. And the divorce statistics were not encouraging. There would be some young man who would think of himself first and foremost, and in a few years he would get bored with Natalie, become infatuated with a new skirt, and demand a divorce. How will weak Natalie take it? A marriage like that would break her heart. She and Tony met at a social event. The couple was interested in this middle-aged businessman, so charming and erudite. They invited him to their place, and there he saw Natalie for the first time. He courted her by today's standards very long 2 years, and only then decided to make an offer. At first, the parents of the girl only seemed that their daughter kind of liked the businessman, but they then did not seriously consider this union, too big a difference in age. But Tony behaved very discreetly, courted beautifully, and gradually their opinion began to change. He would be happy to take care of Natalie all his life, to blow dust off her, exclaimed her mother. Yes, he would be able to give Natalie a quiet life, a good home and wealth. She would not have to think about earning money, and he would hardly run around, agreed her father thoughtfully. The girl herself did not aspire to an early marriage, so her mother had to push her a little. You are beautiful. Many times in life you will notice that someone likes you, she persuaded her daughter, but experience does not come immediately and, as a rule, associated with bitter mistakes. Look at Tony. I'm sure that they will never leave you, and if you get sick, he will do his best to put you back on your feet. You know, how nice it is to have a man who will protect you from all the troubles of life, will not only love, but also spoil. In between, the family went to visit Tony. All three of them were impressed by the large, well-finished house, but Natalie was delighted by the garden, a real work of landscape art. They sat in the gazebo until late in the evening. The artificial light was on. It seemed that hundreds of colorful moths were hovering over the garden. The fountain was beautifully lit and the roses were fragrant. Natalie felt as if she were in a fairy tale. The girls tried hard to like him, and among them even started arguments and bets who would be the first to glue Gortave. But at that time, Herman was not interested in girls at all, and in general in the garden he was bored with the smell of burnt milk, hateful semolina, slightly sweet tea, supervised walks in the courtyard, where there were swings and sandboxes, but not a blade of grass grew, and the endless quiet hour. All this disgusted him in the first 3 days. But his mom couldn't keep him at home. She brought up her son alone, and much later Herman heard another characterization of himself, which would later be repeated not infrequently. A neighbor, an intelligent lady, in conversation with a friend, but in such a way that Herman could hear, called him love child. It is because he is so beautiful that Betty gave birth to him from her lover. She went to the sea, trying to catch the last chance. And there she fell madly in love. And he, of course, was married. And she got pregnant, of course. But I believe that there, on her part, was a crazy, huge feeling. Such children are special. Eyes cannot take away. Herman only grinned at the time, but later decided it was true. His mother never said a word about his father, and if he himself spoke, she quickly turned the conversation to something else. Later, he stopped asking. But since his mother was pulling him alone, she could not whether to stay at home on maternity leave, nor to allow herself to leave work and look for another, which would be more to her liking. So she sat all her life in the office, which people habitually called Machine County Station, although here long ago had been engaged in something else, statistics it seems. Herman never looked into what his mother was doing. He saw the shabby building standing on the highway, and he felt a little creepy when he imagined that a large chunk of his life could be spent in such walls. In the evenings, his mother would come in tired, her back aching, her shoulders aching. She, as she herself said, threw pills and went on the second watch. It is known that housework never ends. And most of all had to work in the summer when you had to go to the dacha and then to process the harvest. Preparations became a significant help, and the mother spent until late in the evening at the stove. And the result of her work were rows of jars, which took up all the free space in the apartment. The mother felt guilty in front of Herman, so she sent her son to summer camp for a month, and if he was lucky, with vouchers for 2. The mother said she was so at peace with her son breathing pine air. They feed him 4 times a day, entertain him, keep an eye on him so that nothing happens to him. She could only dream of a vacation for herself. Perhaps, except for that trip to the sea, she had never had anything like it, although she often sighed to get out by some miracle in the sanatorium. Maybe there she would be cured, and this cursed back would stop whining. Herman was not very happy about the camp either, and deep down he envied the boys who were constantly visited by their parents. Rich Naomi was from a family of seemingly large children, but her brother and sister were older than her and had already left for the regional center and lived there. The father died, and Naomi was left with her mother as a cleaner and her grandmother, who was over 100 years old. Skinny as a cane, old woman in a white kerchief like a shadow walked around the apartment. She could no longer do housework, but she was very fond of people. And if someone came to visit, she would sit next to them and listen. She'd say something affectionate to make the guest feel good. Naomi herself didn't like to stay at home, and having done as soon as possible the work that her mother assigned her, hurried to one of her many friends. Whoever called her first, whoever came to get her, that's who she went to. The children fought over getting Naomi to stay with them all day because she was always so interesting. She invented exciting games, made up stories to listen to. She had dexterous hands. Since she was a little girl, she knew how to cook dinner, clean, wash. You could call her over to the house and start a general cleaning, and it would not be boring, but noisy and fun. And in the end, the apartment is clean and the parents are happy. But when Naomi became older, boys began to appreciate her for the fact that she let them much more than other girls, did not break. She informed faster than her peers. They only had to envy what she has: lush breasts and slender legs. And little by little, the girls, former friends, moved away from Naomi, as they were quite girls compared to her. But the boys were all around her now. They couldn't keep away. But when Naomi came to the camp, all the others ceased to exist for her. There was only Herman to keep her close to. The other boys looked enviously, but Naomi made it so that it was useless for anyone but Herman to count on her attention. Together they smoked at the camp canteen, learned from each other to kiss, and then, in the last school years, and comprehended the science of love. At the same time, they never talked about the future. Herman never once told Naomi that he was in love with her, that someday they would get married, and Naomi did not demand anything. That was her great virtue. Herman was easy and simple with her, but he knew that when he left for the army, Naomi would not be faithful to him for a day. She was all here and now, and there was no hope of her waiting for him. He blamed his mother, too, for failing to do anything to get him out of the service. Money in the house was always a little lived from one mother's salary to another, and there was nothing to make a gift to the doctors or simply slip them an envelope to find Herman some illness that prevented him from military duty. The mother knew her son was displeased with her, and at the send-off, her eyes were pleading, like a dog asking for forgiveness. Naomi did not come to see Herman off. She did not want to sit in the circle of his friends. In a few days, she would be seen in the company of another fellow, and she did not want Herman's friends to reproach her with infidelity. Herman himself expected the worst from the service hazing and everything that goes with it, but nothing terrible happened to him, and in due time he returned home safe and sound. Only he became perhaps even tougher and more cynical than he was before. First of all, he wanted to escape from the life he had had so far, but he knew he could not achieve this by studying. Book science only irritated him, and he saw that he was not by nature capable of wiping the institute bench for a few years, preparing for exams, and then running around with his diploma, trying to get a job somewhere. Something else had to happen, but he didn't know what. He deserved better than what was around him. So let fate give him a chance. He got a job as a security guard at a sports club, passed his driver's license, and later took out a loan for a used foreign car. For his mother, it meant a lot. She had never had a car, and the appearance of the family iron horse she perceived as a transition to a new level of prosperity. Herman gave her part of her salary, and mother began to save money little by little. She wished of herself, afraid to breathe, so as not to scare away the dream. Herman would do well, then he would move on to a job that paid even better, and then he would reach even greater heights. Then she'd get new teeth, and maybe enough for a neurosurgeon's surgery, and her back would stop hurting so much. Is it any wonder to start the day with a handful of pills so you can ruin the rest of your health? Herman worked out for free at the gym where he worked. Muscles became relief, he tanned, and these bright eyes on a swarthy face, this unruly black hair simply drove girls crazy. After his return, he hadn't looked for Naomi. He'd been told that she lived with the son of a former gangster whose name had been whispered in the 90s. Well, to hell with it. Herman had girls, but no permanent one. He made them realize from the very beginning that they owed each other nothing. Because the girls, though they were young and handsome, each of them was able to drag him to the bottom. Get married as soon as possible, have a child, and start demanding everything from her husband, from scratch. An apartment in the mortgage, repairs to make others jealous, trips somewhere in Turkey, the cooler the hotel, the better, and so on, and so on. Their demands would multiply to infinity. But he wasn't going to waste his life working for one of these brainless chickens. Let them not count on it, because all their dreams are, by and large, cheap. He dreamed of another level and another kind of money. Once a friend called him to star in the crowd. He accepted the invitation with breathless enthusiasm, hoping that a miracle will happen and he will somehow be noticed, and the episode will be just the beginning of his career. But no miracles were out of the question, and paid him dick da little, as said a neighbor. An alcoholic Harry's soul open. He had such a nickname. He had to take a job as a chauffeur for a poor lady in anticipation of bigger changes. She paid a lot more than he was getting at his club. The lady was a small businesswoman, had to drive her around the city all day long, then to suppliers, then to customers, then to lawyers, until then it paid off. Although Herman did feel somewhat humiliated when Sabrina climbed into the car and commanded where to take her. "I'm not your servant," Herman wanted to say, but he restrained himself and reminded himself that he was exactly a servant going nowhere. But later it got worse. Sabrina had her eye on him. Did she really think he'd fall for an aunt twice his age? No matter how much money she left at the beauty parlor, she couldn't hide the age difference. And what kind of future would he have with her? A husband on the run, who tries to make his wife happy with him. Because he pecked the fodder, that is, excuse me, gets money from her hands. Though his own mother would probably have been pleased, thought he had settled down well. Herman remembered that in all these years his mother had only once tried to make some sort of personal life for herself. A middle-aged man appeared in the house, and Herman had been about 12 at the time, the most disgusting age. He hated Uncle Harvey for coming to live with them, and the apartment was cramped. He had to study in his mother's bedroom or in the kitchen, because in the so-called hall, where Herman's sofa stood, now Uncle Harvey sat, watched TV, chewed seeds, and noisily cheered for hours when there was a sports program. And the attention of his mother Uncle Harvey pulled on himself. Herman now got little. One day it was as if a devil had possessed the boy. Herman didn't remember why. He was capricious, insolent, and in the end said so many nasty things to his mother that Uncle Harvey lost his temper. He shouted that Herman must be taken out, and he was ready to do it himself. The boy had a real tantrum, with sobbing and convulsions. The question hung in the air, me or him? And the mother chose her son without a sound. For a couple of days, she still tried to find a compromise, somehow to reconcile their men, but Herman left home and had to look for him with the police. The boy was found quickly. He was just staying with one of his friends. But when he came home, Uncle Harvey was gone. And his mother never brought men home again, or even met them anywhere, not even on the side. Women should serve him, not him. That was Herman's belief. Only then would everything go right. Actually, such a life, which he imagined as an ideal, was only on the screen. And he seriously thought that he will star in the movies, accumulate money, and then maybe will go abroad, go into the modeling business. But before all this, he was as far as the moon. And so far, he did not see what concrete steps he could make to get to this dream. Perhaps he should have gone to the capital, tried to get a foothold there. He parted with his former landlady without regret, and without sparing her, he advised her to look at herself in the mirror more often, and not to cling to those who were old enough to be her sons. The woman cried from humiliation. She had just bought him a gift of a gold signet ring. But Herman threw it on the trellis, said that he was not a gypsy baron and would not be weighed down with Satskami. As he closed the door, he heard Sabrina crying, but he did not experience the slightest feeling of pity. He felt a twitch. When he got home, he was about to go online to buy a ticket to Washington, but then he got a call inviting him to an interview. He forgot that his profile was on. And then it all spun. An elderly man with dry, pinched lips offered him to work as a chauffeur for his wife from time to time to take her to the store and back. The salary he offered was such that Herman only swallowed nervously. For the sake of such a place, it was possible to postpone the trip. The men agreed that Herman would start work the next day. Breakfast to the family resembled a kind of sacred act. That was the way Tony had put it. There were no strangers at the table at this hour. Not even the servants had come in yet. Natalie herself had learned to cook what her husband liked. Toast with raspberry jam was the easiest. When she boiled eggs in a bag, she learned to read a poem over them, timing it so that the white became thick and the yolk remained liquid. The most difficult thing is to brew coffee. At the bottom of the turbine, you need to put a crushed garlic clove on top of cane sugar and heat until the sugar does not begin to melt. Only then you can add freshly ground coffee and water. Natalie cringed the first time Tony showed her. Would he really want to breathe the smell of garlic on his customers all day? But the coffee was really magical, without the garlic notes, as if it had been brewed with some exotic spices. John also came out for breakfast. He was leaving for the university early, and at the table he was already dressed up, in a suit and tie. But he didn't notice what he was eating, absent-mindedly saying hello to his housemates and immersing himself in his smartphone again. Tony, on the other hand, was a sybarite. He cracked an egg with a special silver spoon, checked how well it was cooked, savored every sip of coffee. Usually at this time, he told Natalie about what had come into the store. All the goods were unique. An 18th century table owned by a famous person. The next thing was a historical excursion, and thanks to her husband, Natalie recognized many personalities that were not mentioned in the history books, but were extremely interesting. But this time Tony didn't talk passionately about the chair of Marie Antoinette's maid of honor, but rather casually said to Natalie, "You know, my dear, I have hired you a chauffeur." The young woman raised her eyebrows in surprise. Why? It was then that John broke away from another scientific article. Why indeed? Natalie rarely leaves the house, and if she needs to go anywhere, I can drive her. My darling, Tony looked at the toast and decided that a couple more spoonfuls of jam wouldn't hurt. You're coming back from university at lunchtime, and Natalie has already called a cab several times in the morning. She needs to buy all those plants she's going crazy about. Tony smiled favourably and patted his wife on the arm. Come on, darling, it's not like I'm reproaching you. I love that you're so into all this. So, John, we suddenly find out in the morning that there is a miscanthus, or a rare variety of rose, for sale at the fair, which Natasha's garden can't do without. So a cab, a trip across town. I'm worried. And now I'll have someone to ask for Natasha's trips. But that person will have to pay a salary. What for? Such money? Natalie looked up at her husband. He had always been mesmerized by this moment, such a pure emerald hue he had never seen before. In those long fluttering lashes, he could feel how fake his voice sounded. But Natalie didn't notice anything. And yes, there's one more thing. We're talking about a very young man. He's your age, and I'd like to help him. He's saving money for school. I think here at our place, he won't be under too much pressure. He can work part-time, and he can study somewhere on a part-time basis. Natalie reached for the coffee pot to pour her husband a second cup. He was sure to drink 2 before work. After a few minutes, she forgot about this conversation until the evening. The days were warm and Natalie enjoyed working in the garden until the sun went down. This time she decided to transplant the roses and let them bloom along the path. She hadn't heard when Tony returned. She was on her knees making the bush more comfortable in the hole she dug. Her jeans were soiled, her face sweaty and streaked, and she was fixing her hair with her gloved hand. Tony, as it turned out, was not alone. "Meet Herman, your personal driver," he said. And turning to the young man, he added with a chuckle, "I hope Natalie Sergeyevna will be pleased with you." Natalie rose slowly, straightening her stiff legs. Herman looked at her as if there were no one else around but she and he, and Natalie blushed. She felt at once that her shirt was sweating, that she had long ago forgotten about makeup, and why should she wear makeup when she hardly ever left the house? In short, she looked like a trashy girl compared to him. Herman looked at his new mistress. However, he could not stand such a definition. What was he, a slave? He looked at the wife of the man who had hired him and thought about how rare it was to find women like that, with eyes as naive as a child's, blushing at the sight of strange, attractive men and completely unaware of their own worth. Natalie took the first excuse to slip into the house. Why did Tony have to come up with all this? The only way to win it all back was to not go anywhere. Then Tony would realize she didn't need a personal driver, and the young man would disappear from her life as if he never existed. But at night, as her husband lay beside her, it seemed to her for the first time that there was something unnatural about it. It was the first time she had ever felt so keenly the age difference between them. And without knowing why, she cried quietly, feeling sorry for herself. The next day, Natalie assured herself that she would not see the new chauffeur. She had not called him, she was not going anywhere. But before going out into the garden to finish what she had not had time to do yesterday, she spent an unusually long time in front of the mirror, changed 2 shirts, finally settling on a plaid one. She tied a headscarf around her hair, then took it off, picked up a wide-brimmed hat, then put it aside. Finally, she let her hair down, only at the size of the hairpin to let it flow over her shoulders but not fall on her face. The sunny day was warm but not hot. Natalie was thinking about the composition of roses, whether to add pink roses to the white and dark red ones or not, when she heard a man's voice behind her. "Do you have to do all this yourself?" She turned around impulsively. Behind her stood this young man, Herman. He had approached quite inaudibly. They had servants in the house, of course. One woman cooked, another did the cleaning, and there was a gardener. But they all held themselves quite differently, aware of their position. And this, what's his name? Herman had his thumbs in the pockets of his jeans. He wiggled slightly on his socks and looked at her with a smile. "Where are we going?" he asked. She was confused. "Yeah, pretty much. You can be free today." "I guess. I'll need you," she figured quickly, "by the end of the week Friday. Not for long." "What are you going to do today?" he asked. And again she had the feeling that he was not a driver at all, but just a young man she had met by chance and liked. She wanted to say that she was going to work here for an hour or so, and then John would come back, they'd have lunch together, and she'd be in her bedroom somewhere with her laptop, surfing her favorite social networks, reading something, and then she'd make herself a sandwich, pour a cup of coffee, and watch a movie. 1 or maybe 2 until Tony got back. They always had dinner together. It wasn't uncommon for her husband to suggest an evening out, but he'd give her advance notice. "Natalie, how would you feel about going to the theater on a day like this, to a premiere? The singer you've been listening to all the time is coming to see us. Do you want to go to a concert? I'll get tickets." And Natalie loved going out, as she called it. She even enjoyed getting ready. She had the kind of closet that would have suited an older woman. But Tony himself would bring her to the stores and draw Natalie's attention to this or that thing he liked. And when her hand involuntarily reached for something youthful, for some frivolous dress or blouse, he made her realize with the movement of his eyebrows that it was nonsense, bad taste, and not worth trying on. In the end, she was dressed according to his wishes, but so good. She caught the evaluating glances of women, but there was nothing to pick on except to envy her youth and expensive toilets. And yes, in her life, in which there were so few impressions, each performance turned into an event, each concert caused vivid emotions. But now Natalie realized that she couldn't tell this guy about her reclusive lifestyle. He just wouldn't understand how one could kill time like that. So she shrugged her shoulders, as if to let him know that she had nothing special planned for today. "Let's go to the promenade," he suggested. "How can you sit at home on a day like this?" There wasn't really a waterfront in town, but there was a forest corner where they had laid paths leading down to the reservoir, which, as usual, was called the sea. There was a beach at the water's edge and an alley above it. Pine trees grew on the sides, and you could sit on benches and admire the view. It was crowded here only in summer, but now, in May, when the beach season had not yet begun, and even at the height of the working day. Herman held her hand as they ran down the steps to the alley, and Natalie felt like a complete fool. But not because she had agreed to go, but because she had spent almost the whole spring at home, because she had forgotten about the transience of life, and so many of the same wonderful days had flowed away like water through her fingers. "Tell me about yourself," she asked Herman. Natalie avoided looking at his face, afraid that she would blush again. There was a moment's pause. "I think it won't be too hard for you to work for us. You'll be able to study," she mumbled, which was out of place. "Ah," he said at last, "I see. You're the kind of person who, if your house is on fire, will you call the fire department and ask if they'd be kind enough to come by if they happen to be driving by?" It wasn't his phrase. He read it in a book, but it came in handy. Natalie stared at him for a few seconds, then laughed. "Yes, I'm like that," she admitted. "I'm spoiled, yes. Maybe if I had to fight for my life, I wouldn't be so polite. I'd know how to get my own way. And over there, beyond that cape, is our camp," he said. "I don't know if it's open now or not, but I used to spend my summers there. You didn't go, did you?" She shook her head regretfully. "My parents wouldn't let me go anywhere without myself. No, they used to take me somewhere, but the summer is long. When we come back, I'm alone again without my brother, without my sister." "Did you like it at camp?" The youth thing was so casual and natural. There were no shifts, he shrugged, but sometimes the counselors were great, and it was cool. Of course, he didn't tell her about Naomi, with whom every shift became cool. Herman suddenly felt with a sharp longing how much he missed her. Would Naomi remain faithful to her bandit all her life? It could not be so. He knew her too well. But this girl sitting next to him had other stories to tell, and he began to remember funny incidents and camp stories, and those scary stories that they used to scare each other with before going to bed. It was all pure kindergarten, but he could see that she was mesmerized by these stories. Damn it, had she been kept under lock and key her whole life? The day, from which Natalie had expected nothing special, flew by so imperceptibly as if it were a few moments. They went down to the water, and Natalie took off her shoes and walked barefoot along the shore. She wanted to go upstairs, but there was too much old pine needles on the paths. The needles stabbed her feet, and she had to put on her shoes. Then they sat in an ice cream parlor where there were no other customers but them. There were no delicacies here, but Natalie hadn't had creamy ice cream balls and orange juice like that in ages. She was suddenly so trusting and chatted so easily with this barely familiar man, as if she and Herman had known each other since childhood. She was late for lunch. John had already had a quick snack and was now working in his office. Natalie wondered how she would tell her husband about where she had been. Before, she'd come back from every trip with something to buy, or from the hairdresser with a new haircut, or from the dentist with a healed tooth. But now, she felt as if she were holding a huge balloon by a string, and it was about to lift her into the air and carry her away. But Tony wouldn't understand it at all, and she subconsciously sensed that her husband would be unhappy about it. "A monument," she whispered. "There's a beautiful new sculpture on the quay, and I went to see it." "Yeah, like that." But she knew she'd only mention it if her husband asked her. But the best excuse she could come up with was about the monument, but she couldn't think of anything better. And Tony was tormented by the fact that he realized too late his buddy had told him that everything would happen under his supervision in the house and the plot was full of video cameras. But only now he realized that the young people could go somewhere, and then he would not know anything. He couldn't hire a detective now. Could he? It's just embarrassing, humiliating. Herman came home and stood for a long time in front of a cheap dresser, looking at himself. He had set himself a prey, and he had no doubt that it would not escape him. True, he'd need money, not the small change that jingled in his pocket. He shuddered at the thought of the bank and loans, but his mother seemed to have some money set aside. Now they met every day. Natalie didn't even tell him where she wanted to go. Herman made it up himself. He knew the city and its environs well, and chose those places where there were few people. He did not want to spoil his or Natasha's reputation for the time being. Their walks together looked little like the outing of a rich lady with her chauffeur. It was much easier to take them for a happy couple. Herman looked closely. He had not thought of such an option before, but now it occurred to him. A well-to-do wife could be for him the stepping stone in his career that he lacked. At the same time, Herman did not want to look in the eyes of others Alfonso. He would be disgusted if everyone around him thought that he was bought. That's why he left his previous employer and repented to get involved with older women. But Natalie was his age and looked at him with such rapturous eyes that Herman himself felt he was changing to some extent. He became less cynical around her, became kinder, sincerely wanted to please her. She had previously lived so withdrawn that only now she discovered in this picturesque park on the outskirts of the city, where swans swam in the pond, and stood unpretentious attractions and a quiet cafe. Drowning in the greenery here played a young violinist, and the roof in that historic part of the city there was a viewing platform. Sometimes, however, Natalie and Herman actually went to a nursery or a store to buy plants for her garden, and then they would plant them in four hands. Herman always left just before Tony returned, and Natalie immediately looked forward to the next day. She had never lived so full and interesting a life, and it was not only because of the corners of the city that her companion had opened before her, but also because for the first time in her life she had fallen in love, and she believed that this feeling was mutual. For the first time, she began to forget that John was also living in the house. Now she often dined elsewhere, and did not know whether the servants had called her relative to the table or whether he had been forgotten. And John was such a man that he never reminded her of himself. But it was he who took a moment when no one was at home, approached the young woman and said, "Natalie, can you spare a few minutes? I wanted to tell you that Tony is uncomfortable with your absences." John had never seen that look in her eyes before. She was staring, even a little defiantly, and he knew that there was a barrier, a wall in her soul that she wouldn't let go of. "Did he tell you that?" Natalie asked. What could Tony possibly have to complain about? "He hired me this chauffeur himself so I wouldn't be bored at home. So I'm taking the opportunity to be somewhere. And you should too, sitting there, locked up, on a beautiful spring day like this. Would you like me to go with you?" John saw her eyes flicker and sighed. "Be careful, discreet, if you can. Tony loves you very much." Yeah, he does, he cares." Natalie sounded annoyed. "That's what I heard from my parents. And they never realized that it wasn't enough, that sometimes that care made you want to stick your head in a noose." She left the room in a hurry. She realized that she and Herman had not yet had a single frank conversation, and she might be mistaken in his feelings, which meant nothing was settled yet, and she might have to stay with her husband. And since John had noticed that Tony was upset, it meant that she had indeed gone too far in her frivolity and shouldn't have saved her husband's life. Herman, on the other hand, hesitated for another reason. He had seen Natalie's eyes. He knew that if he called, she would leave her husband for him. But damn it, he was sorry to lose his freedom. He wasn't afraid of Natalie's husband. Natalie is just an old man who will immediately file a divorce with his unfaithful wife. It was important to see to it that the young woman got her share, and the more the better. But even if he does not officially register the marriage with Natalie, she has such a character that she will want to live a real family, spending evenings together, sleeping together, snuggled up together. She'll want and demand fidelity, which he's hardly capable of giving. When he hadn't seen Naomi in a long time, he'd been so crazy to want to see her. There was something special about her that he couldn't put into words, but it was perfect for him, and he'd never known another woman like her. They met occasionally. Naomi would make a date at some stranger's apartment, and she didn't stay long. She always left quickly. And yes, that's where he was afraid, even though he hid it. But one day he told her, "You're going to get me into a nunnery. I'll be shot by your bandit." Naomi had already dressed and was fixing her makeup in front of the mirror. "I should have been in time for you to become like him. Then I would have married you," she said with a slight sneer. "I like to have a little risk in my life, like pepper in a dish, so you've got the best option. I'm cheating on my husband for you, not the other way around." Herman imagined how much ridicule he'd have to endure from Naomi when she found out he got married, so he put off talking to Natalie. 1 week, then another, then another. Then he gave himself another deadline. But the day came when one of Tony's friends asked him, "Did you hire your wife a young lover? Can't handle it yourself?" Walker shuddered as if struck by a blow. The lady was known for her directness and determination. She never spared anyone's feelings. "What makes you think that?" he asked. "Well," she grinned, "I saw this young couple in a cafe the other day, sitting there, laughing, not noticing anyone around them. Apparently, they have the closest relationship. They understand each other half-heartedly." And he, the old fool, hoped that at home there are video cameras everywhere, that the relationship between his wife and the chauffeur will be under his control. He had believed in his heart that there would be no relationship, that his Natalie would pass the test. And now it was as if his face had been dipped in the mud. A stranger. How many more people saw Natalie dating Herman? How many more times would Tony hear about how his branching horn suited him? He arrived home early that day. Natalie was gone, and Walker paced the house from window to window, then came down and walked briskly down the driveway to the gate to wait for the car to show. Natalie and Herman arrived shortly before the time he usually returned. The young man put the car in the garage. Natalie walked him to the exit, but she did not dare to kiss him, probably afraid that the servants from the window might see. Tony kept his eyes on her and saw how tenderly her wife stroked the chauffeur's hand. In that instant, he realized everything he had been told was true. Walker very rarely lost his temper. Everyone around him considered him an extremely restrained man who always knows how to keep himself in control and does not raise his voice, no matter what happens. When people like that lose their temper, it looks scary. Natalie opened the front door and immediately saw her husband. It was as if the young woman had run into an invisible wall. "Come with me," Tony said nonchalantly. He went to his room with a brisk, sweeping stride, and she could hardly keep up with him, wondering what the conversation would be about and what she would say if. He closed the office door behind her and asked the very question, "Where have you been?" She and Herman had gone to the movies, to a small remote theater, and Natalie decided to stay as close to the truth as possible. "At a movie premiere." "Oh yeah? A movie so good that you rushed to see it alone without me. Tomorrow's Saturday. We could go together." "I'm sorry, it just didn't occur to me," Natalie muttered. "I thought maybe you had other plans for the weekend." "I wanted to." "What's the name of the movie?" They weren't at the premiere with Herman. They didn't care what they were watching. They were showing an old movie. But now Natalie was frantically trying to remember what was playing in the central theaters. "I think," she named the movie, but she wasn't 100% sure it was actually showing at the Cosmos that day. "I suppose when you were sitting in the auditorium, your chauffeur stayed in the car." Natalie didn't know what to say. She sensed that her husband knew something. Yes, he actually said he wanted to see that movie too. Why would he be bored for 2 hours in the car? He took a ticket too. Why would he miss it? Tony repeated it almost syllabically. He took 2 steps toward Natalie and began to slap her cheeks. When she recoiled, he grabbed her hair with one hand and continued to slap her with the other. No one had ever laid a hand on her before. Natalie cried like a child, sobbing frightened, and tried to push her husband away. But he himself threw her away squeamishly as if she were a thing. Natalie rushed away from the study, and in the hallway she ran into John. He was usually absorbed in his own thoughts, oblivious to his surroundings. But then he grabbed her hands. "What's wrong with you?" Natalie imagined what she looked like at that moment. Disheveled, cheeks flaming, tears, snot, a button torn off at the collar of her dress. He beat me up, she shouted. Your husband? John was shocked. He couldn't imagine Tony raising his hand against a woman. Who would? I won't let him hurt you. Is he in his room? Natalie nodded, but as soon as John disappeared into Walker's office, she made a decision. Get out of here. She would call Herman now. She had his number. Have him pick her up. If her husband had done this to her, she wouldn't stay here any longer. No more pretending and lying. Natalie was in such a state that she didn't even bother to pack. Her purse, in which she hastily stuffed her passport and money, was enough. 5 minutes later, she was already running down the path leading to the gate. She paced down the street and dialed a number. Come and fetch me at once, she commanded Herman. No, not to my place, to my place. I'll be waiting for you in the park by our house. Come in your car later, I'll tell you everything. It took him about 40 minutes to get to the place she had indicated. Herman guessed what had happened. Natalie wasn't Naomi, so it must have been easy for her husband to expose her. Herman grinned and began to think about what to do in this situation. Natalie did not see him at once. She just glanced at the unfamiliar old foreign car. Herman opened the window and called out to her. Then they drove on, and he listened to her confused story. Of course, he had guessed everything. The only thing he didn't think was that the old man would let loose. He'd underestimated him after all. Where do you want to go now? Herman asked Natalie. She hesitated for a moment. She had thought that now he would take responsibility for her. But he must think that she herself had a plan. She shrugged her shoulders helplessly. Tell you what, said Herman, I live in a small apartment with my old mother. I can't take you there. Let's get you an apartment now, and then we'll settle everything calmly. You just ran away without taking anything with you. Documents and money, Natalie sobbed again. That's good. Herman sighed with relief. It's not a problem to find Hada. We'll find something. And indeed, in a few hours, Natalie was already entering the apartment where they were staying. It was a new house near the forest. The river was visible from the window. The repairs had been done thoughtfully and lovingly, as they say, for themselves. All the furniture and appliances are there, said the woman who showed them the apartment. Natalie sank down on the sofa without strength. Herman came up to her, took her purse from her hands, and asked, Do you have the money on your card? Cash. Good. Now I'll pay for the month. Natalie just nodded. She wished her aunt would leave soon so she could be alone with Herman. She waited for him to say something about the wedding, hoping that he would calm her down, tell her that the terrible scene would not happen again, that he would be able to protect her from her husband. But Herman continued to talk to the landlady, and at the same time, the telephone rang in Natalie's purse. John. She didn't answer it right away, and when she did, she sounded fearful. Yes. Natalie, Tony and I had a long talk, although I admit that at first I wanted to kill him on the spot. And what did he? Her heart sank. John paused for a few seconds too, but when he spoke, his voice sounded calm. He's giving you a divorce. Gives you a divorce, says it was bound to happen sooner or later. He's too old for you. That's not the point. Natalie exclaimed in despair. A man can be any age. It just happened. I never loved him. I was just nice to him. I married him. I don't know why. No, I know my parents talked me into it. I understand, John said, I understand. But you, with your temper, when you get divorced, it'll probably be easier, won't it? Yeah, she said, I guess so. Yeah, will you file? Or should I let him do it? Let him do it and I'll sign it, Natalie said. Just tell me where to come and when. She finished talking and walked around the apartment, which she had yet to get used to. It took her a while to get used to it. There was not a crumb of food to be found. Natalie wanted a strong cup of coffee, but she had to go to the store for coffee, sugar, and bread. Herman looked at her questioningly. Tony's giving me a divorce, Natalie said. And also, do you know where I can get coffee nearby? Wait, he gestured at her as she grabbed her purse. Divorce is a given. Your husband would have given it anyway. Where would he go? I want to ask you about the split. What do you get? Do you have a prenup? I don't remember. She smiled confusedly. I wasn't interested in it then. I think I signed some papers. My father talked to Tony about putting a sum of money in my name as some kind of insurance, but I don't even know how much. You're not a business lady. You don't have a job. What are you gonna do for a living? I've talked to Tony about a job many times, but he's always been against it. Asked me what I was missing at home. He said that maybe the hour would come when I'd have to go out and work somewhere, but God forbid. In the meantime, I could pamper myself, or rather, he wanted to pamper me. Natalie was embarrassed and silent, and Herman raised his eyebrows. I know that my parents left me an inheritance. Natalie tried to adopt a business-like tone, so I won't be poor in any case. Even if Tony doesn't give me a dime, I'll take some courses, then I'll get on my own 2 feet. I've got no one else to rely on. I'm on my own. Here it was impossible to keep silent, and Herman made it clear that he would not leave her, and of course would support her. They went to the nearest store and bought everything they needed. Herman suggested that Natalie arrange with her husband when she could pick up her things. I don't want to go back there, she shuddered. I'd rather buy new things. I don't need that much. He just sighed. Natalie's habits were still barbaric. But nothing. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad and she'd be able to get a decent amount of money from her husband. It was a good thing she'd brought the money with her. She could have expected him to be a gentleman. Where would he get the money to dress a woman from scratch? You can't go to the market with Natalie. She probably has her own favorite stores. That night, he lay awake for a long time wondering what to do next. He talked himself into it, saying that he should buy a lottery ticket, that is, marry Natalie, because she could not protect her own interests, and he could do it for her. And then, relying on his wife's money, he would be able to make certain steps in life. He desperately did not want to tie himself down, but he mentally repeated that then it would be possible and divorce would not be difficult if there were no children in common at Naomi's moment. In the meantime, he would not find a better option than Natalie. He just needed to know exactly how much money she had and how much money she could count on from Walker. It all came to light within a week. It turned out that her parents had left Natalie enough money to buy everything she owned, even an apartment. And of course, after the divorce, she would also get quite a bit. Herman proposed to Natalie. I can imagine how strange your first wedding was, he said. A bride who has no feelings for the groom and agrees only to please her parents. It's going to be different for us. The young woman's eyes shone as never before, and she agreed to everything Herman suggested. They will not organize a lavish celebration, of course, but an evening in a restaurant would be obligatory. The closest friends would come. What? Natalie has no one to invite, just John. Well, he'll introduce her to his buddies. It'll be fun. Give me money for the restaurant, mother, Herman threw to Valentina Sergeevna. She only flung her hands in confusion. Where from? All right, don't be stingy. I know you've been saving on your card. Where's the card? It's for treatment. Betty couldn't finish. Come on, what do you need treatment for? You'll outlive us all. Herman raised his finger, saying, I know, and took out a little jewelry box from the closet. There, at the bottom, was a bank card. I think you have the PIN code, he said. I'm not mistaken, am I? Herman, the mother said in a pleading voice, I have a dental appointment that week. I wanted to get a denture. Well, you'll reschedule, and that's it. And then you'll save up as much as you need, sell the cottage. What do you need it for? Natalie and I won't go there, and you're already having a hard time. How much would you get for it? It's a plot of land and a booth where you keep your shovels. There's not even a decent fence. But Herman wasn't listening. He withdrew everything from his card at the ATM and shook his head. His mother had saved, and yet he had to add more so that there was enough for a good table in the restaurant and for alcohol. John refused to come. Are you mad at me? For some reason, it was especially painful for Natalie to bear it. No, I'm not. I just don't know how to. I'm always uncomfortable in unfamiliar company. I'd rather come by afterwards and congratulate you. But Herman got a call from Naomi asking him, I hear you're getting married after all? You can, but I can't. He answered in her tone. Why not? On the contrary, I'm waiting for you to invite me to the wedding. But you have to be invited together with your husband. How will you explain it to your bandit? My husband is in the hospital. Kidney stones. Bandits get those too, so I'm gonna be my own boss for a while. Do you want to organize with you a bachelor party or a bachelorette party? She laughed. In short, I'll help you say goodbye to your bachelorhood. Herman could not refuse her. And the unsuspecting Natalie felt truly free for the first time in years. She went shopping. That's just what it was called. She would leave the house and wander the streets, admiring the city, studying it. She was fascinated by the simplest things, a fountain in the park, pigeons flying into the square, an open coffee shop where the aroma of coffee and pastries wafted from. She didn't know prices, and in the store she often got into trouble, accepting what the saleswoman insistently offered her and then berating herself for spending too much money. She signed the divorce papers, but did not return her maiden name anyway. She would soon be wearing Herman's surname. They applied to the registry office and the wedding day was appointed. What Natalie was happy with was her dress. Cream lace, it suited her amazingly. She put on her own makeup and styled her hair. Looking in the mirror, Natalie realized that she looked as young as if she had just turned 18. They had been booked in the afternoon, but the restaurant was booked for the evening. And to pass the time, together with Herman's friends, they went to the countryside. They decided to take pictures, to have a picnic of sorts. Yes, it was all strikingly different from Natasha's first wedding, so prim. Then the girl was all worried about her dress with a train and remembered to take care of it. Carefully sit down, stand up. God forbid to drop food on her knees. And now Natalie was splashing on the water and her hair fluttered in the wind and she felt so happy. And they'd arrived at the restaurant in such a cheerful company, as if it were not a wedding, but a student's party. Natalie hugged Herman's mother. She had seen Betty before, but the first meeting had been fleeting. However, Natalie looked at her mother-in-law as if remembering something. Naomi was the last to arrive. She got out of the car in a tight black dress and a bouquet of roses, and as always from that moment on, everyone was looking at her. Naomi didn't seem to notice anyone. She handed the roses to Natalie and then turned her gaze to Herman. "Congratulations. From the bottom of my heart, I wish you a long, long happiness." No one but Herman sensed the sarcasm in her voice. It was so subtle, so inexpressible. "Thank you," he replied in her tone. "Who was it?" Natalie asked a little later, when Naomi had left. "A former classmate," he answered. Luckily, there were no traditional contests or anything like that. Natalie would have been embarrassed to be involved in all that. It was just a party, followed by live music and dancing. Natalie thought back sadly to her parents, wondering how they would have felt about her choice. Maybe they would have been upset because she was out of the golden cage, and now they didn't know what awaited her. Or maybe they'd be happy for her, because Herman is wonderful. Betty, Herman's mother, unaccustomed to alcohol, became tipsy after the second glass of champagne. And she spoke loudly, unaccustomed to herself. "How glad I am. You can't imagine what it cost me to raise him. It's hard to imagine raising a child alone, to endure all his illnesses, all his whims, to endure all the slanted glances. Nowadays, it's easy to take it easy, but back then, a single mother, as you know, I grew up in poverty. And Herman couldn't take it. Maybe he had too much to drink." "Shut your toothless mouth," he told his mother. He said it softly, so that only those who sat near Valentina Sergeyevna could hear. And Natalie, of course, heard. Tears came to the woman's eyes, and then Natalie stood up with a glass in her hands. "I want to raise this one to our parents. Unfortunately, mine can be happy for me from where they are now. Yes, I'm an unfortunate orphan, but Dad, Mom, know that I remember you and love you. And about Herman's mom, I want to say an amazing thing. I was born very weak. My parents were afraid they wouldn't be able to take me out, and my mom lost her milk. And then our old district doctor advised us to find a nurse. Yes, not any bottles and formula, but like this, a woman to hold me at the breast, to rock me, to feed me. And I remembered my mother told me. My nurse became Betty, so I owe it to her that I grew up the way I am now. And I'll call her mom not only because she's Herman's mother, but she's like a second mom to me." Everyone applauded. "And Herman is your milk brother," Naomi said with a grin. "What interesting things are coming out. The evening, as they say, is getting darker and darker." Natalie glanced at her husband as he accepted her confession and saw that Herman could hardly contain his rage. After a few minutes, he realized he couldn't help himself, squeezed Natasha's wrist and hissed, "Let's go outside for a minute." He literally dragged her into the men's room and pinned her against the wall. "What are you spilling out your warm memories for, huh? Who asked you to? Do you realize what you're saying?" "I thought," Natalie babbled, "it's really such a coincidence. It's touching. He literally growled, "Do you understand what it takes? My mother didn't have a cent of money then, and I was a baby in her arms. She left me with a neighbor and a bottle of milk and semolina and went to your place to feed you. She was paid every day in the evening, and she used the money to buy food. So you do that too? No, he cut off. I mean, my mother told me that there was zero money then, so she sold her milk. But I didn't know it was about you. You did worse than she did. Mother just blabbed about how poor we lived, and you showed that it was poverty already over the edge. Natalie sobbed into the palms of her hands. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, she repeated. That's right, you didn't have to be ashamed of your rich ancestors. You can go back to your guests, said Herman, and I'll go wander around a bit. Maybe I'll calm down, or I'll get on someone. They settled in a rented apartment, the same one Herman had chosen for Natalie. Let's buy our own, the young woman suggested. Why'd we have to pay the landlady month after month? Wait, Herman said with a little irritation. Choosing an apartment is not a quick process. If you make decisions like that, you'll soon be without a dime in your pocket. Yeah, you're out of a job. Natalie said it without a second thought, but her husband flipped out. And you've never even had a job. You'll start to feel differently about money once you've had a chance to find something suitable. You're only now discovering how much money is worth. I've been used to counting cents since I was a kid. Why do you say that? She asked with sad bewilderment. I'm not arguing with you. Whatever you say. If we have to wait, we'll wait. And you will choose the apartment for us too. I really don't know much about it. I'd like something better, of course. He didn't know why he didn't want to settle down and buy his own place, or rather, he guessed, but he was afraid to admit it. He wanted to be able to be free again at any moment, without the hassle of divorce, property division, and so on. Let's wait, he said again. And Natalie nodded. Of course, it was out of the question for them to move in with Betty. Herman had a real aversion to his old home, to that rundown Khrushchev apartment in a neighborhood where everything about it spoke of poverty. He found a new job fairly quickly, again as a security guard, now at some bank. He never told Natalie the details, but the fact that now Herman left early every morning was a reproach to her. She was going to look for a place of her own as soon as possible. Her first purchase was a good laptop. Natalie signed up for a course in landscape design, downloaded the necessary programs. She got into it and stayed up late working on projects. Betty started coming to see her, and more often. At first, mother-in-law felt very uncomfortable, fearfully walked around the apartment, cautiously touching things. You must be paying a lot of money for all this, she asked cautiously. Is it enough money? Betty herself felt as if the ground had gone out from under her feet. Now, as before, she had not a dime to her name, and is that any way to approach retirement? So that old age, with its sickness and infirmity, would not weigh too heavily on her shoulders, and she put away every penny. I didn't want that much, she confessed to Natalie with an embarrassed smile. Well, this denture, and my eyes to have cataract surgery, and my winter coat. Why did you give everything to your son? Natalie reproached her gently. We didn't need anything. We just had tea at home, that's all. Herman is like that. He doesn't tolerate objections, and he likes a good life. It won't do him any good, of course. Sooner or later, it'll come back on him. He was so funny when he was growing up. He came up to me once and asked me, Mom, how do turtles die? Me, without taking my eyes off the book. Yeah. How do turtles die? I look up at Herman and see that he's ready to cry. Sonny, they fall asleep and go to turtle heaven, and in general, they live 300 years. Why do people live so short? People can live a long time too, if they live the right kind of life. Herman disappears and reappears with a sheet of paper and a pen. Write to me, I want to lead a proper life. I want to see grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I write him various platitudes: need to eat healthy food, sleep 8 hours, to not get nervous. Since then, he's been channeling me about every sausage. Is this healthy food? Does it make you live 300 years? Betty turned the conversation to other things, but the daughter-in-law wouldn't back down. Why don't I give you your money back? Natalie suggested, and you can buy whatever you want. I'll pay you back out of my own money. Herman will never know. God be with you. Betty was frightened. I shouldn't have told you about it in the first place. I was just making a point. And Herman, you don't know him yet. He must have counted every penny in your family budget. He can't keep anything from him." But Natalie realized her plan and transferred the money to Herman's mother's card. But what she didn't expect was a scandal, which happened the very next day. "What did you spend such a large sum of money on?" her husband asked her, gesturing away from breakfast. Natalie began to explain, not doubting that Herman would appreciate her kind attitude towards her mother-in-law. "Stay out of our relationship with my mother," he ordered icily. "What are you saying? It's your mother?" Natalie's lips trembled. "You already showed your love for her at the wedding." "I didn't know what to do. I was so embarrassed." "What are you trying to do now?" "I wouldn't think of doing anything. And there's not much time to fight." Natalie was afraid when Herman took that tone. "Forget it. Your mom's finally getting better. And we're young. We'll make money. You can't give up your rich lady habits, can you?" Herman leaned toward Natalie and looked her straight in the eye. She was afraid. After her husband had beaten her, she was afraid of a repetition of something similar, afraid of pain, of a man's fury. "How much did you earn?" Herman lifted Natalie's chin. "Can you tell me? Is money the most important thing for you?" She asked bitterly, "If for their sake you are ready to destroy everything between us. And after all, we still have plenty left." He pulled himself together with a visible effort and changed his tone. "Fool," he said, "I've got an apartment on mortgage, a new building, a great neighborhood, a dream layout, and all that we have, it will go to her and even have to pay extra. And you could ruin it." "I'm glad you found an apartment," she said, "but to make your mother happy, I'll settle for a simpler place." Nevertheless, Herman insisted that they would take the apartment he liked, even if they had to pay for it for a while. Natalie had no idea that her husband already had a plan in his head. Recently, Naomi had come into the bank where he worked. She was a regular customer and didn't expect to see an old friend. With her trademark smile, in which there was always a sneer, she approached him. And Herman could not help it. He wanted to meet her as it was before. At the same time, he even turned pale with humiliation. She is a rich lady, a customer of the bank, and he in the form of a guard must protect the money and her capital too, including. "Shall we meet?" he asked in a sort of careless way. "I don't think so." "Why not?" He stepped in her way. "My bandit wants to move, so I'll be here for a few weeks." And then Naomi made a gesture with her hand, saying, "Phew, you, look for the whistles." "So where are you going? Or you're not gonna tell me?" "New York," she said simply. "Well, you always knew we were going out for a while." "I didn't think your marriage would last," Herman confessed. "I thought you'd get tired of your thug and leave him." "And marry you?" She raised her eyebrows. "You never asked me to marry you. And as for leaving, you're wrong to think it's so easy to do. You're not the only one who's attached to me, darling." Herman returned home that day in a gloomy, brooding mood. Neither Natalie nor Betty, who had just come to visit the young people, could bring him out of this state. "What's the matter?" At last Natalie asked. "What's the matter?" "You don't want to tell me so as not to upset me. When will you stop thinking that everyone is protecting you?" He said, "Please don't touch me today." He went to bed early. And when he heard Natalie humming in the kitchen, clearing the table, he shouted irritably, "Don't whine, please. You have no voice, no hearing. You're just whining on one note." Natalie silently walked over and sat next to him on the edge of the bed. "Let's talk," she said. "I think you hate me. Why did you have to start this whole thing? Do you regret leaving your rich husband for me? Go on, go to him already." Herman put a pillow over his head so that he wouldn't hear anything else. Natalie fell asleep that night in tears. If her parents were alive, she would have gone to them today. But she really had nowhere to go. The next morning, she definitely did not make her husband breakfast, lying in the bedroom with the phone, flipping through the pages of the internet. Herman packed up and left very quickly. In the afternoon, her sister-in-law was again visited by Betty. She noticed that Natalie was very sad. "Living with Herman is not a gift," she said in an apologetic tone. "But if you are patient, if you learn to understand him better, you will gradually get along." "If I have the patience," Natalie cut vegetables without raising her eyes. With 4 hands they prepared dinner, but Herman did not come at the proper time. Hour after hour flew by, but he did not appear. His telephone did not answer. And now the women looked at each other with fear. Something must have happened. Betty was the first to voice their worries. He'd never stayed out this late. Natalie's voice sounded frightened too. Being a security guard wasn't just a decorative profession, especially in a bank. Maybe there'd been a robbery or something. But why is the phone disconnected? Natalie couldn't take it anymore. I'll call the bank on the landline. No, that's stupid. There's no one there at night, or there's another guard on duty. I don't know, honestly. Herman never talked to me about it. Both of them were in a state of anxiety. At 12 o'clock in the morning, the doorbell rang. Natalie's eyes were so horrified at the bad news that Betty got up herself. Sit down, I'll open the door. You're as white as a wall. Wait, nothing is known yet. But hearing unfamiliar male voices in the hallway, Natalie found the strength to go out. She saw an elderly man, gray-haired, stout. He wore an expensive black coat. Behind his shoulders stood a young man, and Natalie thought it was a guard, a bodyguard. As it later turned out, it was. Oh my God, Betty clutched her hands to her chest. It can't be. Herman had just gotten married. Here's his young wife. Smart, beautiful. What are you talking about? It couldn't be like that, just like that. The old man turned his icy eyes on Natalie. Your husband ran off with my wife. I'm Gob, Naomi's my wife. Natalie's mouth dropped open and her lips quivered. You don't know anything, do you? There was a slight accent in his voice. He's not coming back here. But if he does, yeah, you'll call me. If you find out where he is and you hide it, then you'll be the same as him. You understand, don't you? I'll find him anyway. But sooner is better. It'll be less painful for him. Jesus, but you're gonna kill him, aren't you? That's what Betty said. And you, Mother, don't say anything. I'm not asking you to call. You won't anyway. But he couldn't, cried Betty in a small voice. Gob just waved his hand. He took another hard look at Natalie and walked briskly out. He wasn't even here. For a few moments, the women didn't move. Then Natalie held her head in her hands, and Betty began to frantically pace around the apartment and wail. Where do I call? Natalie, Tony. He's a real thug. He's going to kill Herman. Him or his thugs. Natalie, why don't you call the police? I don't know where else. But if we don't do anything, I don't understand, Natalie said slowly. So he married me, and Naomi is not just his classmate, and he wanted her, not me. I thought I was a plaything for my first husband, but it turns out that for Herman, I'm just a rag under his feet. Why do you keep thinking about yourself? Think about him. A guy like Gob, he's gonna get you out of the ground. Natalie walked past her mother-in-law into the bedroom and fell on the bed. Hour after hour passed and she didn't move. Betty was calling someone, saying something excitedly, but Natalie could not understand the words. She was in some kind of viscous muddle. She couldn't move, she couldn't think. She was very dizzy. But the news that came the next day had finished the women completely. Naomi didn't even think about running away. She was preparing for the move, organizing the packing, and keeping in her head 1,000 other things that needed to be done. So Herman's call came as a complete surprise to her. I really need you, he said. Let's go to a place and talk. Herman, it's not just a risk anymore, Naomi said tiredly. You're just pushing it. I told you that's it. We're done. I'm going with my husband. I need to talk to you one last time, she heard. If you don't agree, I'm gonna go to your Gob and tell him all about us. You're signing up for him to kill you. Naomi clutched the phone. Are you out of your mind? Tell him you don't want him to, because he'll kill you too. Naomi, I'm asking for one meeting, that's it. I will never call you again. Can't you get away for 2 hours? I knew someday you'd set me up real bad. All right. In 20 minutes, meet me at that cafe on the corner. Done, he said. When Naomi was already approaching the small coffee shop, Herman called out to her, opening the car door. Get in. We have to go somewhere. I'm not going anywhere with you. Sure you are. Go ahead. Call your husband. Complain that you're being molested by an angry lover. Do you want me to complain about myself to your arson? Equals Naomi got into the car next to Herman. Her body was found outside of town, next to an old road that was rarely traveled. Naomi had been thrown from the car at high speed. Considering that Herman had taken every dime of Natalie's money, it was clear what had happened. Herman persuaded Naomi to leave with him before it was too late, promising that they would have enough for the first time. The young woman refused and paid for it. Herman went into hiding. Better let him kill himself, said Job, or I'll take the job. And then he'd be worse off. A lot worse. He'll still be wishing he was dead. Natalie and Betty were no match for each other. Natalie left home. Later, she could not remember that day. She wandered the streets, not knowing where she was going. Several times she was almost hit by a car. Then she sat in the park, feeling her head ache more and more. She could hardly think in front of her eyes, and everything went dark and blurry. Then everything blurred. Passers-by noticed a young woman lying near the bench. She didn't look like an aunt who had had too much alcohol. Well-dressed and clutching a dainty purse. They called an ambulance. She didn't regain consciousness for a long time. Doctors made no guarantees. Severe meningitis, anything can happen. John barely left the hospital. When Natalie regained her ability to understand what was happening, she was so weak that she didn't have the strength to keep her eyes open for long. She was lying in a private room. John was sitting next to her. He hardly ever left the hospital these days. The worst was over. But Natalie was lethargic and indifferent to everything. Why did they take care of me? She asked John. I don't want to suffer anymore. Why is it all over? It's over, isn't it? John gently took her hand. You're completely, totally free now. You're young. You can start over. Natalie shook her head, which still ached mercilessly. I don't want to anymore, she said. I feel so trashy, so dirty. John took a deep breath. Listen to me, he said. I'd like to postpone this conversation until you're well again, but I don't think that's going to happen. Herman has already disappeared from your life, and he's not coming back, but he's alive. I don't know that, John said firmly, and Natalie realized he wasn't lying. But you know, I don't care much about his fate. If God gets even with him, then so be it. Tony's dead. Stroke. Don't blame yourself. He had high blood pressure all the time. That's probably how it would have ended. He had no heirs, and everything he had he left to me. I don't know why he did that. Maybe it was because I lived with him for a few years and took care of him in his last months. Did he ever think of me? Natalie asked. For the first time, there was excitement in her voice. John put his finger to his lips. He did, but not in the way you think. He didn't blame you. He blamed himself. He shouldn't have married you, although he did love you when you were very young. But if you love a man, you don't have to take him for granted. You can ruin everything. He could just help you find your happiness. Natalie licked her lips, searching for a word. Is that angelic? There's no such thing as selflessness. It does if you really love, John argued, and he finally realized it. But he went away thinking you were fine. Wait a minute. Don't mind me. You need to get better now. Get back on your feet. You've been very sick, so it's gonna take time. And then I'm gonna get you out of this town. Where to? To a warm island far away, he said. I don't think you want to see anyone right now. Let's go to a place where we can rent a house on the beach. You'll sit and look at the sea. Listen to the splash of the waves. Do you want to? It's a fairy tale, she said tiredly. And Betty? I'll go away with you, and she'll be left without a son, with a broken fate. Let her suffer, right? She deserves to have a son like that, doesn't she? We'll take care of her, John promised. 6 months later, Natalie sat on the porch of the small house, watching the sun set over the sea. It seemed to her that her past life was somewhere far, far behind her. And had it all been? No, John hadn't given her the island, but they had come here to live. It turns out that in addition to the fortune left by Tony, John had his own money. He had won several prestigious awards. He had scientific developments. It's just that he's always attached very little importance to material things. But now, in order to take care of his beloved, these means were put into action. This distant island was quite large. So many Americans lived there that a school was open for their children. That's where Natalie got a job. Well, not exactly where she became a teacher, but there was a beautiful garden around the school, and there she worked with a zeal she had never expected from herself. John had an easy time with his work. He was connected to the world through the internet. For Betty, Natalie was calm. The old woman had been cured, and the amount of money she now had in her account allowed her to think no more about her daily bread. There was no word from Herman, and Betty was glad of that. She was sure if Gob had found her son, she would have heard about it. Natalie's life wasn't easy. If she wasn't working in the garden, she was working around the house. She went to the market and learned to cook delicious meals from unfamiliar fruits and vegetables. She was worried about John, who was still so engrossed in his work that he forgot to eat and was still thinking far away. Natalie could hardly get him away from the computer so that the two of them could go to the sea for a swim or just walk around the streets of the small town. On weekends, they often had friends who came to stay with them. And then they would stay outdoors for a long time, and American songs that they would not have sung in their homeland now moved them to tears. "Are we ever coming back?" Natalie asked John once. He looked at her carefully. "Is that really what you want?" She shook her head slowly. "No, not yet. We'll live here as long as you want," he told her. "Maybe we'll grow old here. Why not? Doesn't it matter from where one steps onto the staircase that leads to another world?" Her head was in his lap. It made it easier for her to look at the stars. She already recognized many of the constellations well, tracing familiar shapes with her finger. But there was no need to talk about love with John. Everything was clear without words.